In the outskirts of New England, whispers tell of a creature once buried beneath the ancient forest, a being they call Labu. No one knows where it truly came from, a banished monster from another world, or the spawn of age-old nightmares. But one thing is certain, it never dies. Anyone who hears the chattering grind of its teeth in the dark vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only bones gnawed clean and a strange glimmering tooth that seems disturbingly alive. The old wooden cabin lay deep within the New England forest, where Marjorie Hale and her son Ethan had just moved after years of being pressed into the chaos of city life. Marjorie hoped this remote refuge might soothe the wounds carved into them both, the boy still drowning in the loss of his father, and herself, brittle with grief. Yet from the moment they stepped inside, the air carried a weight that could not be explained away. The walls sagged with rot, flaking paint, peeling like shriveled skin. The floor groaned beneath each step, as if resenting their presence. Beyond the windows, the forest loomed like an endless wall, its branches intertwined, stretching outward like massive hands intent on blocking any escape. Marjorie whispered reassurance inside her own mind, telling herself it was only the strangeness of a new place. But deep within, she recognized that the silence here was not peace. It was a breath held too long, waiting to break. On their first night, the wind shrieked through the cracks, carrying with it the damp stench of rotting leaves. Marjorie lay awake on the ancient bed, eyes wide against the dark. Then, from somewhere within the forest, came a sound. A brittle clicking, the unmistakable gnash of teeth, near, then far, then suddenly rasping right against the window pane. In the room beside hers, Ethan shifted in his sleep, his small bed rattling as if footsteps circled around it. Marjorie held her breath, heart hammering in her chest, as a single thought gnawed at her mind. The tranquility she had sought was nothing but a fragile veil, stretched thin over a nightmare waiting to be awakened. The next morning, a heavy fog smothered the forest, swallowing the sun as though it had never risen. Marjorie awoke exhausted, her mind still echoing with the brittle grinding of teeth from the night before. Ethan sat motionless at the kitchen table, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his expression so empty it was impossible to guess what he had endured in the dark. While cleaning, Marjorie discovered a strange mark on the porch, deep, parallel gouges as though something had clawed through the wood with dozens of sharp talons. Wedged within the splintered cracks, something glimmered. She pried it loose, a long, unnaturally pointed tooth, its surface slick and gleaming, cold as steel. She slipped it into her pocket before Ethan could notice, though a creeping dread gnawed at her chest. That afternoon, she resolved to learn more about the land they had come to. In the small town's general store, locals turned wary and evasive at the mention of her new address. Only one woman responded, an ancient figure seated in the corner, her tangled silver hair framing eyes that seemed to sink into darkness. She called herself Hazel, the oldest surviving resident of the town. Her voice carried no emotion, as though reciting a curse. The forest had once been marked by an ancient being, one the native people had named in a trembling whisper. Labu. It was neither animal nor spirit, but a living entity that fed upon human souls. Those who heard the gnashing of its teeth would soon see, in their dreams, a smile stretched grotesquely from ear to ear. And once it appeared in a dream, escape was no longer possible. Marjorie left the store with her hands trembling, her coat pocket heavy with the sharp, unnatural tooth. Hazel's warning rang in her mind like metal scraping against metal. She did not want to believe it, yet denial was impossible. The silence of the forest was nothing more than a
have a
shroud,
visitor.
hiding something that had been waiting far too long. Jenny, Eldigai. Night fell faster than usual, darkness swallowing the last streaks of color along the horizon. Marjorie sat at her desk, struggling to focus on the page before her. But her thoughts never drifted far from the gleaming tooth. It lay in the drawer, yet seemed to whisper into the silence, a faint clicking sound that prickled her skin with cold dread. Ethan sat in the corner of the room, his gaze fixed on the black expanse of forest outside the window. He said nothing, but his eyes refused to turn away. Marjorie almost told him to go to bed, but hesitation froze her tongue. Some irrational fear that if she looked away, even for a heartbeat, something from the darkness would step inside. That night, the nightmare came for Ethan. He dreamed of a forest unfamiliar, where the moon had been devoured and only a pale, sickly glow remained, cast from countless jagged teeth jutting up from the soil. They clattered together in a deafening chorus, a death-rattle symphony without end. From within that forest of teeth, a pair of hollow eyes opened, and slowly, a smile stretched wide, curling grotesquely to the ears. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his back slick with cold fear. In town, news spread quickly. A young girl named Janice had vanished along the path leading into the woods. Police launched a search, but all they found was her bloodied backpack and scattered shards of bone, pale as chalk. Sheriff Duane insisted it was the work of wild animals, a bear perhaps or wolves. But those who saw the remains swore the bite marks were too long, too sharp, to belong to any earthly beast. Marjorie joined the search party, and near the trail's edge she found something she could no longer ignore. Nestled among rotting leaves was a tooth, the length of her finger, gleaming as though freshly polished. When she lifted it, it quivered faintly in her hand, alive with some unnatural pulse, and the sound of grinding teeth throbbed directly in her skull. That night, back at the cabin, she placed the two teeth together. They clicked against one another, a brittle rhythm that sounded disturbingly like words in a language beyond human comprehension. Marjorie froze, breath caught in her throat. Ethan entered the room, his face pale, and whispered that he had seen the smile again in his dreams. Without a single word between them, Marjorie understood. The darkness in the forest was no rumor. It was real, and it was reaching for them. Alice. After Janice's mysterious death, the small town sank into uneasy silence. Doors were locked before dusk, streets emptied long before the sun was gone. Yet Sheriff Duane clung to his explanation that wild animals were to blame. His words echoed through the loudspeakers in brittle monotony, dry and meaningless. A thin curtain straining to hide the truth, bleeding slowly from the forest. Marjorie knew better. The two teeth in her drawer never ceased their clicking, striking one another in the silence of the room. By night, the sound burrowed straight into her skull, carried on an unseen current that dragged with it fragmented whispers. They spoke of hunger, of a smile widening in the dark. Ethan grew paler with each day, his eyes open wide through the nights, for whenever he dared to close them, he was crushed again by visions of teeth erupting from the earth, hemming him in. One morning, a figure waiting on the porch froze Marjorie in her tracks. It was Richard Cole, an anthropology professor and an old acquaintance from her university years. He had heard that Marjorie had moved here, and more importantly, he had heard of the disappearances. Richard was not surprised. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting it. He opened a worn leather-bound journal, revealing pages filled with faded sketches of a grotesque figure, a gaunt, hunched body, a mouth cleaved nearly across the face, bristling with hundreds of disordered teeth. Richard explained that in the folklore of an ancient tribe once rooted in these lands, there existed a being called Labu. Born of hunger and darkness, it had been sealed beneath the earth through ritual sacrifice. Yet, when that seal weakened, Labu would return, hunting by planting fear and drawing its victims into dreams, where it shredded the soul before ever touching the flesh. Marjorie was struck numb. Ethan's nightmares, the teeth in her possession, everything matched Richard's words. But the most terrifying revelation lay in a line from the old manuscripts. Whoever keeps its teeth shall be the first to be devoured. That night, the grinding no longer came from the drawer. It seeped from the walls, from the floorboards, from the window frames. The wooden house seemed to sprout invisible teeth, clattering against one another in endless hunger. Ethan clutched his head. His scream caught silent in his throat, while his wide eyes reflected a sickly green light from some source unseen. Richard stood frozen, his face ashen, the realization striking him like a blade. Labu was not merely hunting. It had already caught their scent. Outside, the wind ceased. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. From the forest, the clicking rose in a frenzied chorus, a death march rattling through the night, heralding that fear was no longer rumor. It had spread like a plague without form. And at its center, Marjorie's house had become the gathering place for a thing that had waited centuries to wake. That night, the wooden house seemed to transform into a colossal body. Every crack exhaled a clicking rhythm, the sound spreading everywhere like the gnash of 1,000 teeth. Marjorie sat frozen, her fingers clenching the ring of keys, but the whispers seeped into her skull, thick and sticky as sap. They carried no language she recognized, yet their meaning was undeniable. Let us in. Let us taste. Ethan lay curled on the bed, his small frame trembling. His eyes stared wide at the ceiling, where the cracks slowly warped. From the timber, jagged teeth sprouted, lengthening, clattering against one another before breaking loose and falling like hail made of bone. Each piece struck the floor with a high-pitched chime, warped and shrill, like a child's laughter twisted out of shape. Richard Cole scribbled furiously into his journal, sweat streaming down his temple. He muttered of an infiltration stage, the moment when the entity marked its prey. But his words no longer carried knowledge. They read like a death sentence, written out loud in real time. Marjorie rushed to the bed and pulled Ethan into her arms. His body was ice cold, lips tinged blue, his mouth moving faintly. She pressed her ear to him and nearly screamed. Ethan's voice was gone. From his throat came only the rhythmic clatter of teeth, perfectly in sync with the house chorus. Darkness thickened around them, not an ordinary absence of light, but a viscous shroud where twisted forms writhed and pressed against reality. Within it, a grin unfurled, stretching ear to ear, illuminated by a sickly green glow. Labubu did not step through the door. It split out from the air itself, as if the house had been its womb all along. Its hollow eyes fixed upon Ethan. Marjorie felt the pull of an invisible force, wrenching her son from her embrace. His body rose, suspended in the air, while the teeth erupting from the walls angled toward him, clattering like a triumphant hymn for the predator's feast. Richard screamed without sound, scrawling frantic tribal sigils across the floor with chalk. But the markings dissolved instantly, swallowed whole as though licked clean by the dark. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, realizing every fragment of knowledge he carried was nothing, mere scraps of paper before a hunger older than language. Marjorie lunged, gripping Ethan's hand. A green luminescence spread across his skin, veins glowing like half-chewed strands. In his eyes reflected the vision of an endless forest of teeth, waiting to consume his soul. Then, amid the frenzy of grinding jaws, the room filled with a chorus of whispers. No longer vague, but sharp and merciless. He is mine. You will witness. You will surrender. Marjorie felt her blood congeal in her veins. She understood. Labubu had chosen Ethan, and her role here was never chance. She was meant to bear witness, or pay the price to keep her son. Outside, the forest convulsed. Leaves rustled, not with the wind, but with the rhythm of countless unseen teeth, laughing. The cabin shook, planks splitting away to reveal a yawning abyss beneath, as though the earth itself were opening its jaws. In that instant, Marjorie knew the nightmare was no longer Ethan's alone. It had stepped into reality, and nothing could stop it. The house collapsed inward like a cage, its wooden walls splitting apart to reveal massive teeth jutting from the darkness beyond. Labubu emerged, gaunt, hunched, its mouth splitting half its face, lined with hundreds of teeth crowding together, jagged and uneven like a forest of silver blades. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan, suspended in the air, his body bathed in a green glow that shone like a beacon of death. Marjorie lunged forward, desperate to wrench her son free from the invisible force. Her fingers brushed his hand, but Ethan's body was dissolving into ash, pulled toward the gnashing maw of the abyss. The whispers thundered now, sharp and merciless. He is mine. You will surrender. Richard fell to his knees, mumbling fragments of ancient incantations, but every word evaporated the instant it left his lips. Human knowledge crumbled against the raw, primal hunger of the beast. All he could do was witness, helpless, as the monstrous mouth yawned open at the center of the room. Marjorie clutched Ethan tightly, her eyes blazing with defiance. From deep within, she understood. To save her child, another soul must be offered. And the only soul left was her own. Teeth rained around them, gleaming like a storm of knives. She drew one last breath, whispering into her son's ear, "Live." With the final strength in her body, Marjorie thrust Ethan out of the green radiance, hurling him into Richard's arms. At that instant, she was lifted, dragged straight into Labubu's gaping mouth. Her scream was swallowed whole, merging with the relentless clatter of teeth as the house convulsed like a body choking down the last trace of light. Then, silence. The cabin stood still, lifeless. Ethan lay unconscious in Richard's embrace. Marjorie was gone, leaving only a void of cold air. At the center of the ruined floor, one long tooth still glowed, pulsing faintly, clicking in a steady rhythm, like the breath of something asleep, waiting. Richard carried Ethan from the cabin, never daring to look back. Yet in the forest's darkness, the sound continued, grinding teeth, unbroken, endless. Labubu had retreated, but it had not vanished. It was waiting for the next hand to pick up the tooth that remained. And when that moment came, the cycle would begin again. Ainun Parwat. On the outskirts of New Orleans, hidden among oak trees draped in green moss, the old manor of Maison de Lune still stands, like a scar carved into time. They say that nearly a century ago, it bore witness to a wedding steeped in blood, when the bride, groom, and every guest perished in a night of unspeakable slaughter. Since then, on every full moon, those who dare to draw near swear they hear the wail of a violin and the echo of laughter spilling from its darkened windows. Inside, the celebration never ended. The bride and groom remain, but their faces are gone, and they are waiting for new guests to arrive. Oh. Lydia was a freelance journalist, known for chasing legends and folklore across the American South. New Orleans had always captivated her with its strange blend of voodoo, Catholicism, and the restless ghosts of its past. Yet among the many chilling tales whispered in the city's streets, none unsettled her quite like the story of the Maison de Lune estate. One night, Lydia slipped away from the French Quarter and drove toward the crumbling manor. The locals' warning still rang in her ears. On the night of the full moon, never go near Maison de Lune. But to Lydia, a taboo was nothing less than an invitation. She stepped out of her car, carrying only a flashlight and her worn notebook. When she pushed open the iron gate, a rush of cold air swept out, laced with the acrid tang of rust and the sweet rot of decayed flowers. She followed the broken stone path, each footstep echoing unnaturally in the silence. The closer she came, the louder her heartbeat seemed to thrum. The manor loomed like a corpse in hibernation, waiting for someone to rouse it. And Lydia, with her insatiable curiosity, had willingly become its caller. The air inside Maison de Lune was thick with dust, yet it echoed with sounds that did not belong to the present. Lydia stepped through the grand hall, where enormous mirrors once gleamed, but now lay dim and clouded. For a fleeting instant, she saw her reflection, blurred, indistinct, her face lacking detail. She staggered back, convincing herself it was only the moonlight distorting her image. Then suddenly, a violin began to play. The melody was distant yet sweet, drawn out like a wedding hymn. Lydia held her breath, listening. The music seemed to pour from the ballroom. When she pushed the door open, the sight before her froze her blood. The room glowed with unnatural light. Chandeliers, heavy with dust, blazed with golden fire. Hundreds of figures in 19th century attire glided across the floor in elegant waltzes, their movements silent, their footsteps soundless. But the horror lay in their faces, blank, featureless, like masks never carved. At the far end of the room stood the bride and groom. The bride in stark white, the groom in jet black. Neither bore a face. Instead, where their features should have been was a dark void, a hollow that pulled at Lydia's gaze like a black hole. Suddenly, an unseen guest pressed a glass into her hand. She flinched, dropping it. The red liquid inside splattered across the floor like blood, but in seconds, it vanished, leaving the stone spotless, as though it had never been. The violin fell silent. In that instant, every faceless gaze in the ballroom turned toward Lydia. Auntie. The ballroom froze. Lydia felt as though she had misstepped in an endless waltz, her body out of place in a ritual that had never stopped. The faceless guests had no eyes, and yet she felt them staring, every inch of her skin prickling under their gaze. The orchestra resumed, but the music was no longer sweet. It was shrill, discordant, a cacophony that rattled her bones. The dancers moved again, but their steps were stiff, jerking like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. One guest drifted toward her, lifting her hand as though inviting her to dance. She recoiled, trembling, but its grip was ice cold, the texture hard as bone. Lydia lifted her eyes, and the blank void where its face should have been split open. From the fissure, dozens of skeletal hands clawed outward, raking at the air. Laughter erupted, rolling across the room from every direction, though she could not tell which mouthless figure it belonged to. In the cracked mirror along the wall, Lydia saw her own reflection, yet her face was gone. In its place stretched a smooth, featureless expanse of white. Panic surged. She stumbled back, but another hand clamped down on her shoulder. The bride, her white gown dragged across the floor, stained with sprawling rust-red streaks. The faceless bride leaned closer, her hollow visage a void that threatened to swallow Lydia whole. The music swelled to a fever pitch. The orchestra, those faceless musicians, revealed their secret horror. Their faces had not been lost. They had been stripped away, dangling like masks from the very instruments they played. Each tortured note bled from human flesh. Lydia tried to scream, but her voice died in her throat. The faceless hand reached up, pressing against her cheek, clammy, wet, and unyielding. The sensation was unbearable, her skin stretching, tugging, ready to be torn away. Nyaha, inchadi. The violins shrieked, splintering the air like hundreds of knives clawing at her eardrums. Lydia collapsed onto the ballroom floor, her ears ringing, vision swimming. Yet the scene around her only grew sharper, more grotesque. The faceless guests began to peel away their coverings. One, then another, then dozens. Beneath the white veils were stitched together faces, black threads holding scraps of skin that had never belonged to them. Some faces hung loose, half-attached, exposing the bruised flesh beneath. When they laughed, the sound poured from hollow cavities, echoing like wind howling through crypts. On the banquet table, the towering wedding cake split apart, oozing thick, dark red fluid that stank of rot. Wine glasses filled on their own, brimming with viscous, metallic liquid that sloshed over the rims. Guests raised their cups in unison, toasting, as blood splattered across the white tablecloth. At the center of the room, the bride and groom drifted forward. Their garments, white gown, black suit, fluttered as though gravity no longer applied. They extended their hands toward Lydia, beckoning her to join the wedding. But Lydia knew this was no invitation. It was a sentence. The room convulsed. Doors slammed shut. Candles erupted into flames. Shadows swarmed across the walls like 100 grasping hands. The orchestra changed its tune. No longer a waltz, but the slow, crushing march of a funeral dirge. The violins screamed, no longer instruments, but the cries of souls bound into their strings. A new row of seats appeared, draped in blood-red cloth, reserved for fresh guests. Lydia's breath caught. She saw familiar faces, Marcus, Jonah, stripped of every feature. They sat stiffly, lifeless, hands on their knees, puppets awaiting command. Their flayed faces now hung nearby, ready to be grafted onto the musicians. "No, this isn't real," Lydia whispered, but her voice dissolved beneath the monstrous symphony. The bride raised her hand. Two faceless attendants clamped down on Lydia's shoulders, forcing her to kneel in the center of the hall. A shredded bridal veil dropped over her head, suffocating her in damp darkness. The drumbeat pounded like a colossal heart, pressing the air from her lungs. Then came the final rite. The giving of the mask. The faceless groom approached, holding a human face still dripping fresh blood. The skin mask sagged, eyes clouded, lips pale. Lydia froze in horror as recognition pierced her. Jonah's face. She screamed, thrashing, but the iron-cold hands held her fast. The mask was lowered toward her own, warm blood pattering down her neck. She felt her skin stretch, tug, as though ready to be flayed and replaced. The wedding bells rang 3 times. The hall roared in unison, a ragged chorus chanting, "Welcome the new bride." In that moment of terror, Lydia understood the most dreadful truth. This wedding would never end. It always hungered for more brides, more grooms, more guests. And now it was her turn. The veil smothered Lydia, suffocating her with its weight. Wedding bells tolled, each peal twisting into the shriek of violins scraping bone. Faceless hands clamped down on her shoulders, forcing her head upward. The groom raised Jonah's blood-slicked face, ready to fuse it to the emptiness where her own should be. In that instant, Lydia saw herself reflected in the mirrors lining the hall. Dozens of them. In each one she was someone else, clad in a bridal gown, seated among the faceless orchestra, twirling without features across the dance floor. Each reflection stared back at her with hollow eyes, each future the same, an endless prison with no escape. The guests erupted in laughter. The veil was torn away, and Lydia found herself draped in a white gown. A moment ago she had worn her worn jacket. Now the dress hung heavy, sodden with blood. The former bride was gone. Lydia now stood in her place. The faceless groom clasped her hand. The touch was colder than ice, and with it surged a poison that spread through her veins. Lydia tried to scream, but no voice came. Her lips moved soundlessly, though somewhere nearby violin strings sang, echoing her every motion. The orchestra roared, and the wedding feast resumed. The faceless guests whirled, spinning around Lydia and her new groom. Blood streamed across the marble floor, yet they glided over it as if it were polished glass. Each step left a red imprint that fractured into cracks, spidering through the stone. Through the haze, Lydia clung to a single thought. If I must stay, I will remember. She tried to hold on, to the music, to the stitched faces, to the laughter scraped raw. But memory itself dissolved, slipping away like mist on the wind. She no longer remembered her name. She no longer remembered why she had come. There was only the wedding. There was only the endless dance. Outside, the full moon bled red across Maison de Lune. Inside, the celebration endured, a faceless bride and groom presiding over an orchestra of stolen flesh. Laughter, music, and bells blended into a grotesque symphony. From time to time, neighbors on the outskirts of New Orleans swore they heard it. The distant waltz, the clinking of glasses, the muffled invitations of voices without faces. They barred their doors, avoiding the road that led to the manor. Yet, curiosity always claimed some. Footsteps always wandered too close, and each time, the feast grew louder. The orchestra swelled. Maison de Lune never sleeps. It hungers for guests. And Lydia, forever veiled in her blood-soaked gown, smiles an invisible smile, bound to the faceless wedding symphony, forevermore. Kenna, E-E-K. At the edge of a small Midwestern town, the decaying church of St. Aurelia still loomed over a field of wild grass. They said that more than a century ago, the villagers knelt within its frigid nave and struck a covenant with the devil to escape famine. Each soul offered was sealed inside a candle, and the altar became an orchestra of silent screams. Though the church has long been abandoned, whenever the wind cuts across the plain, a faint yellow light still flickers through the shattered windows. And people believe that if a foolish hand ever dares to spark a flame again, the covenant will rise. And whoever lights, it will never leave home. Ali, wow. Nathaniel pulled his car to a stop along the muddy road, his eyes fixed on the massive shadow rising from the field of wild grass. St. Aurelia Church. The stonework lay in ruins, its roof collapsed in jagged gaps, yet it still radiated a grim, funereal majesty. He opened the door, and the early autumn wind rushed in, cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and rust. Nathaniel was a scholar of folk religion. He had heard dozens of rumors about St. Aurelia, where, long ago, the villagers forged a dark covenant in exchange for survival. Most dismissed the stories as superstition, but he did not. In an old library in Chicago, he had unearthed a tattered manuscript that spoke of the breathing candles of this very church. From that moment, obsession clung to him, driving him here. Stepping through the rotted wooden doors, Nathaniel felt at once that the air had thickened, as if he were stepping into the chest cavity of some colossal beast. Each breath grew heavy, each footstep stretched into echoes that refused to die. He swept his flashlight across the nave. There, on the altar, dust lay thick, except for the faint marks of fingers pressed recently into its surface, withdrawn in haste. A gust of wind tore through the church, the doors groaning. And for an instant, Nathaniel was certain he saw a faint glow at the far end of the nave. He blinked, and darkness returned. His heart pounded. Nathaniel drew out his recorder, his voice whispering into it. St. Aurelia, Day 1. I can feel a presence here, and I believe the candles remain, waiting to be lit. Behind him, the darkness seemed to whisper back, soft and sibilant, in a tongue that did not belong to man. No. Nathaniel moved deeper into the nave, his flashlight sweeping across damp, moss-cloaked walls. The air grew heavier, choked with mildew and the acrid tang of old ash. He stopped at the altar, brushing a hand across the thick blanket of dust, then froze. A rustling noise echoed from the far end of the church. His chest tightened. The beam jerked wildly. A shape darted between the ruined pews. Who's there? Nathaniel's voice cracked, trembling against the silence. The shadow suddenly lunged forward. Nathaniel staggered back, pulse hammering, nearly dropping his light. The beam caught a face, haggard, familiar. Eyes bright, hair unkempt, a camera swinging from his neck. Eli? Nathaniel gasped, scarcely believing. The other man stiffened, then let out a shaky laugh. Nathaniel? Christ, I thought you were something else. The tension eased for a heartbeat, though the dread clung stubbornly around them both. Eli Turner, an old friend, once a fellow traveler on field expeditions, was here, inside the rotting shell of St. Aurelia. What are you doing here? Nathaniel asked, voice low. I could ask you the same. Eli raised his camera and snapped a photo. They say this place is haunted, I figured I'd see if my lens could catch anything strange. Didn't expect to find you chasing whatever dark faith you're still obsessed with." Nathaniel didn't answer. He only gestured at the altar. "Do you see it? The wax stains. They've never really gone out." Eli frowned, half skeptical, half uneasy. But before he could reply, a sharp crack rang out, like flame catching a wick. A faint, sickly glow flickered across the altar. A lone candle shivered into flame, though Nathaniel knew he had not touched it. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the ruined walls. Eli lowered his camera, his face gone pale. You see it too?" "Yes," Nathaniel whispered. Wind shrieked through the broken windows, splintering into a chorus of whispers. They swirled around the two men, hundreds of voices rising and falling in a tongue that did not belong to this world. Every syllable scraped at their skin, raising gooseflesh. Eli gripped Nathaniel's shoulder. We should get out, now." But Nathaniel shook his head, his eyes alight with fevered conviction. "No, Eli. This is the proof. The covenant never ended, don't you see? They sealed their souls into these candles." The single flame flared violently, casting light across cracked walls. Within those fissures, Nathaniel thought he saw faces, dozens of them, pressed against the stone, their mouths moving soundlessly. Eli turned away, hands trembling around his camera, no longer daring to press the shutter. Silence thickened. Then came the sound of wax dripping, tick, tick, like blood falling onto the cold stone floor. Eli edged back. "Nathaniel, if you still have any sense left, we should leave before—" His words cut off. The entire nave erupted in light. Dozens of invisible candles roared into flame, their jaundiced glow painting the fractured ceiling. In that glow, shapes coalesced, pale figures lining the central aisle, standing as though in a funeral procession that had never ended. Nathaniel clutched his recorder tight. Eli swallowed hard, eyes wide in horror. Both men knew in that instant they were no longer observers. They had become unwilling guests at a ritual that had never ceased. Now, the jaundiced glow of dozens of candles filled the nave. Their light gave no warmth. Instead, it chilled Nathaniel to the marrow, as though he were standing inside a morgue. Eli gripped his arm tightly, eyes wide, no longer curious but stricken with absolute terror. Along both sides of the aisle, hazy figures began to stir. They had no faces, only man-shaped husks wrapped in wax, chests hollowed inward, arms curled tight like melting effigies. Each movement cracked and splintered like brittle wood. One figure broke away from the front row. The flame on the altar candle bent toward it, as if feeding it with breath. Layer by layer, its skin peeled away, revealing a glistening, pulsing substance beneath. Nathaniel and Eli watched as the thing warped, flesh winding and knotting into the form of a living candle. Its arms stretched into waxen branches split with fissures, and from its mouth spewed molten wax, hissing as it struck the stone floor. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Eli let out a strangled cry, stumbling back against a splintered pew. His camera slipped from his hands and shattered on the stone, forgotten. The flesh candle flared, a crimson flame erupting from its brow. Its light made the other figures quiver in unison, as though awaiting command. From its warped body came a groan, layered, 100 voices weeping at once from a single throat. "Oh God, oh God," Eli whispered, clutching Nathaniel's shoulder. But Nathaniel could not look away. Terror bound him, yet some dreadful fascination held him still. He listened and realized the groaning carried words. Not random sounds, but names. The names of Saint Aurelia's villagers, one by one, called from the dark. Another candle on the altar flared to life. A second figure stepped free, its skin cracking, wax pouring down its body. The stench of burning flesh rolled through the nave. Eli gagged, pressing his hand to his mouth to keep from vomiting. The whispers swelled, clearer now, their chant unmistakable. More to be lit. New blood for the light. Nathaniel fumbled for his notebook, scrawling frantic notes with a trembling hand. Eli snatched at it, hissing, "You're insane. This isn't something to record. It's something to escape." But before their argument could rise, the two flesh candles lurched forward. Beneath their feet, wax sizzled like acid, eating through the flagstones. A droplet spattered onto a fallen pew. Within seconds, the wood sagged into ash. "Run!" Eli screamed. They bolted down the narrow aisle, the sickly glow dogging their steps. Nathaniel slammed into a crumbling wall, his hand striking a small wooden door. Without a thought, he shoved it open. Both men tumbled inside and wrenched it shut behind them. The small chamber reeked of scorched wax, heavier than the air outside. Their breaths rasped in their throats, seared as though they had swallowed fire. Nathaniel's flashlight swept the room, then froze. Before them lay a circle of candles, dozens of them, encircling a stone altar. But these were no wax tapers. Each was a human finger, bone and flesh fused together, fingertips burning with steady red flame. Eli broke into sobs, voice trembling. "Nathaniel, this isn't a covenant. This is hell." Outside, fists pounded the door. The flesh candles had found them. The flames atop the altar suddenly roared skyward, illuminating ancient sigils carved into the walls, a curse that had never been broken. And in that moment, Nathaniel understood. They had not stumbled upon a relic. They had awakened a covenant that promised no escape. Yee! Footsteps thundered through the darkened church. Nathaniel dragged Eli forward, breath ragged, the stench of burning wax clinging thick in the air. Behind them, the wax figures dragged themselves across the floor, hissing softly like candles cracking as they melted. They burst into the confessional, only to see the walls splitting, wax seeping through like congealed blood. A hand seized Eli's shoulder. Nathaniel swung his flashlight like a club, shattering it, and pulled his friend onward. The nave yawned open before them, and the scene had changed. Every pew was filled with waxen shapes, all heads turned toward the altar. Upon it stood a single colossal candle, burning crimson, its light bleeding across the stone like liquid fire. Before it, a melting priest shape preached, voice booming against the fractured walls. The covenant has never ended. The flame must be fed with souls. The heat scorched their skin raw. The congregation of candles began to rise, staggering forward, limbs splitting, their bodies dripping foul black resin. Nathaniel clenched the drawings in his hand. The ink had bled scarlet, revealing a sigil of a broken candle beneath the altar. His mind reeled with clarity. The only escape was to shatter the seal. "The crypt beneath the altar!" he shouted, dragging Eli through the swaying throng. The wax creatures grasped at them, shells splitting, oozing a stench of rot and ash. At the altar's base, Nathaniel's palm found a hollowed stone. He pressed hard. The floor trembled, splitting wide to reveal a spiral staircase plunging into the depths. The priest's shape roared. From the great red candle lashed tendrils of molten wax, cracking down like whips, searing the air inches from their heads. Without hesitation, Nathaniel and Eli hurled themselves down the stairwell, heat pursuing like a living tide. Darkness thickened around them until, at the bottom, a monolithic stone door loomed. Carved upon its surface was the image of an inverted burning candle. From its fissures seeped the sound of countless voices, whispering, sobbing, cursing, begging. The door groaned as it began to open. A cold wind surged through, snuffing out the light behind them. Nathaniel felt the pull of inevitability. Beyond this threshold lay the true heart of Saint Aurelia, where the fate of the Covenant, sealed for centuries, would finally be decided. Hi, Ain Silwims. The stone door shuddered open, and darkness surged out like a flood of ice. Nathaniel and Eli stepped inside, their hearts pounding in their chests. Beneath their feet, the floor was split with jagged fissures, from which oozed thick, red wax, like blood boiled into liquid. At the chamber's center rose a colossal candle, vast as an ancient tree. Its flame burned crimson, casting a sickly glow across the cavern. Around its waxen trunk were fused human forms, mouths frozen open, eyes dripping like molten wax, their bodies rigid yet trembling as though still alive. From them came low, overlapping moans, a grotesque chorus of suffering. Eli staggered back, voice trembling. Nathaniel clutched the drawing, the sigil of the broken candle glowing like a wound. He understood. This was the root of the Covenant. The blood candle, devouring the villagers' souls to fuel the sect's unholy power. As long as it burned, the ritual would never end. "We have to extinguish it," Nathaniel whispered, though his breath shook with fear. They stepped forward, but the priest's voice echoed from every wall, thick and dripping like wax. "None shall break the covenant. This flame is your blood." The monstrous candle flared, tendrils of red wax uncoiling and lashing down. They wrapped around Eli's legs, dragging him toward the trunk. He screamed, thrashing, but the wax was as unyielding as iron chains. Nathaniel lunged, pulling desperately, but the candle clutched tighter, hungrier. "Go!" Eli shouted, eyes wild with both terror and resolve. "You have to destroy it, even if I don't make it." Nathaniel shook his head, tears brimming, but Eli shoved him hard toward the flame. In that instant, Nathaniel understood. Only a final sacrifice could end it. Eli lifted his face, his eyes gleaming in the hellish red light. "End it." And then he let go, surrendering himself to the candle. His body was swallowed whole, the flame surging higher with a shriek that rattled the earth. The chamber convulsed. Nathaniel seized the moment. He tore the last relic from his pack, a flask of sacred oil scavenged from the archives, and hurled it into the heart of the fire. A deafening roar split the air. The blood candle screamed, fissures ripping through its body as imprisoned souls burst free, wailing in a torrent of cold wind. The light collapsed into itself, plunging the cavern into utter blackness. When Nathaniel awoke, he lay among the rubble, outside Saint Aurelia. The night sky loomed above, moonless, silent. No Eli, no moans, only the crushing stillness of a grave. He staggered to his feet, his hands caked in hardened wax, a mark that would never fade. The crypt, the candle, all gone, along with Eli. But deep within the silence, he caught the faintest whisper riding the wind. The covenant is not finished. Nathaniel shivered. Somewhere, in the shadows of Appalachia, the blood flame still waited for another sacrifice to awaken it once more. Pixie.